Tonight's keynote speaker, Megan Phelps-Roper, has her own interesting story to share. When I first learned that she was being considered as the keynote for this evening, I immediately recalled why the name sounded familiar. A few years ago, the Westboro Baptist Church, the church in which Megan was raised, was coming to picket at synagogues and schools in my community of Great Neck, a community well known for its large Jewish population. The WBC had made a reputation for public protests against Jews, the military, and members of the LGBTQ community. They crave publicity, often demonstrating at funerals in order to maximize attention, and seem to live to provoke reaction. Knowing that, many Jewish groups counseled restraint, not to give the WBC what it wanted, while other Jewish groups argued that hatred needed to be openly resisted, an issue we are now confronting, albeit in a different context, in our current national circumstances. Well, the WBC came, and while the picketing proved uneventful, just their presence caused division in our community. Megan was raised in this Westboro Baptist church, based in Topeka, Kansas. When the church's picketing started in 1991, Megan was just 5 years old. From that time forward, she participated in the picketing almost daily and ultimately pioneered the use of the WBC social media. Megan left the church in November 2012, and you'll hear about the reason shortly, and she has since spent time with many of the targets of her former church. She started her ADL journey in 2014 in Chicago, where she spent a week with ADL at Camp Shy, marching in the Gay Pride Parade and meeting with young professionals who had followed her journey. Megan found herself empowered by her experience in Chicago and realized that she was in a unique position to impact the hearts and minds of youth around the country. She quickly realized that ADL was an organization that would allow her to make a strong impact. She has since spoken at ADL events around the country and most recently was honored at the Concert Against Hate. Megan is here tonight to speak about her experiences and her new path to bringing Tikkun Olam into the world. In this time of heightened concern about the rise of the alt-right, and with hate crimes increasing, as you've heard referenced several times tonight, we salute the courage of Megan Phelps-Roper, and I am pleased to welcome her to the podium.
My name is Megan Phelps-Roper, and I spent the first 26 years of my life at Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas. I could only see it in hindsight, but growing up at the church was a case study in extremism and indoctrination. Before I could read, I was memorizing Bible verses to explain why God despised gays, Jews, and everyone who wasn't part of our church. Before I started kindergarten, I was standing on public sidewalks holding signs with messages like, "Gays are worthy of death." I grew up with the understanding that I was in grave danger at all times, that the world and its inhabitants were full of evil, and that they would seduce me away from the truth if I didn't maintain constant vigilance. With only 70 or so congregants, our church was tiny, but what we lacked in size, we made up for in the force of our beliefs. We were vocal, dedicated, and active in as many ways as we could devise, arranging our lives around the work of the church, which we believed was the work of God, and the only hope for mankind. Because my grandfather was the church's founder, and my mother its most influential member and organizer, it's no surprise that I found a special place in the church too. My mother used to call me her right hand, and at her side, I became a skilled defender of Westboro and its many controversial doctrines. It didn't hurt that both of my parents and most of the adults in the church were attorneys, Their arguments were well-crafted and tightly woven, and I learned those lessons well. Whether it was for the Howard Stern Show or local television news, I was frequently called upon to give interviews. I traveled with my mother to represent the church's positions in schools across the country, from high schools and universities to the FBI National Academy at Quantico. I felt so thankful to God for giving me the ability to speak for him. But it wasn't enough. We were holding at least 4 protests every single day in our hometown, and 12 on Sundays, and sending teams of picketers to cities all across the country several times a week. We were hosting journalists and documentary film crews from around the world. We were creating short films and written content to upload to the church's website. We were designing and sending anti-gay and anti-Semitic press releases to every fax number we could unearth. This was the 90s. But none of that was enough. That was our spirit, that we could always do more, and we were forever looking for new ways of doing so. And then, like a gift from God Almighty himself, along came Twitter. I discovered the platform and became Westboro's voice there in 2009 when I was 23. I had no way of knowing that Twitter, of all things, would be the beginning of the end of my unshakable faith in the God and worldview of Westboro Baptist Church. Twitter seemed perfect, a tool that was easy to use and so effective at getting attention. It rewarded clarity, simplicity, and directness, which our message had in spades. After all, it only took 1/10 of a tweet's 140-character limit to announce to the world that God hates Jews, as I did regularly. It required so little effort to find and attack Westboro's targets, and I was ready and willing to defend our doctrines and our beliefs against all comers. What I was not prepared for was kindness. It came from unlikely sources: a Jewish blogger whom I had attacked just days after joining Twitter, a Christian seminary student who was offended by Westboro's celebration of tragedies as judgments of God, an anonymous lawyer who was offended by the crude language we use on our signs. Each of them responded to my tweets in heated anger at first, exactly as onlookers had always done at our protests. What I failed to realize in the beginning, though, was that the dynamics on Twitter were fundamentally different from anything I'd encountered before. At protests, there was screaming and chanting and mocking and bitterness and sometimes even assaults and arrests. On Twitter, it could be calm. It was questions and jokes and quiet in a way that pickets could rarely afford. And because pickets only lasted for a few hours at most, there was no way to develop any sort of rapport with counter-protesters. On Twitter, the conversation was ongoing. It lasted for months that turned into years. I continued to argue the Bible with others on the platform, but we also celebrated one another's birthdays and anniversaries. I listened to the music they recommended. I watched their children grow older in the photos they posted. I saw their grief when loved ones passed. And in time, I started to grieve with them. It was an astonishing and, for me, deeply terrifying turn of events. This was not the truth that I had been taught. These were satanic arguments and feelings that would lead me to eternity in hell. But the dialogue on Twitter worked in the other direction as well. It helped my opponents see me as a human being too, and their behavior also changed. In spite of the terrible things I was saying, they reached across the divide to listen to me. In spite of their abhorrence of my beliefs, they befriended me. And as they developed a more nuanced understanding of Westboro's doctrines, they were able to find logical inconsistencies, the first I'd ever seen, and they kindly, respectfully, and civilly challenged me. It took time, energy, patience, and strength, but their efforts completely changed the course of my life. When those seeds of doubt eventually bloomed, I left Westboro knowing that my family and community would cut me out of their lives forever. They had to, because God required them to deliver me to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. The church had been my entire identity, so when I walked away from Westboro, I walked into a void. I didn't know who I was or what I believed. I was terrified of my own mind, the mind that had been convinced, and not just convinced, but passionately dedicated to the proposition that my primary duty in this life was to warn everyone in it, everyone else, everyone outside, that they were going to hell and that they were doomed. I knew I had hurt so many people, and I had no idea how to do anything to make it right. In the midst of that void, I came upon ADL. When a friend recommended I speak with an ADL staffer about getting involved, my immediate response was revulsion, a feeling I developed over years of protesting ADL offices across the country. This was the enemy, my instincts told me. But I'd stopped trusting my instincts at that point. In the same way I had questioned and rejected Westboro's judgments of the LGBTQ community, Jews, and others, I knew that I needed to reevaluate ADL. And what I saw was profoundly encouraging. I saw a group of people who understood that hatred and prejudice are learned and that they can be unlearned. I saw people who were as dedicated to fighting bias and intolerance as my family was to spreading them. People who were working in schools, in the courts, in law enforcement, on the internet, working to protect civil rights, to end discrimination, to educate young people on how to recognize and take a stand against bigotry. I watched an ADL video that declared, "We're trying to change the culture from one of hate to one of respect." I was still so uncertain about what I believed, but even then, it was clear to me that ADL's mission of securing justice and fair treatment to all was a crucial one. And so, in spite of deep-seated fears and suspicions, I took a chance and responded to a message from ADL. Now, 2 years later, I could not be more grateful to ADL for taking a chance on me. Over the past 2 years, I've had the opportunity to work with regional offices from Boston to San Diego and in a wide variety of settings, at LGBTQ community events, churches, synagogues, and interfaith groups, and to speak with hundreds of students in middle schools, high schools, and universities. I walked with ADL in the Chicago Pride Parade in 2014, which was the same one that I had protested just 2 years earlier. And through ADL's efforts as the nation's top non-governmental trainer of law enforcement, I've even had the chance to work with agencies like the FBI to help shed light on the mindset of extremists. The more time I've spent thinking and talking about my experiences, the more I found clarity on one of the most important lessons I think I've learned in all of this. It's that when people are in the thrall of poisonous ideology, it's really not all about deliberate ill will or inherent hatred or lack of intelligence. It's about the unbelievable destructiveness and staying power of bad ideas, and about finding ways to equip people with the tools they need to fight hatred and prejudice in every form they take. Given the proliferation of incidents of racism and anti-Semitism in the wake of the presidential election last week, our commitment to these efforts is more important than ever. It seems clear that there is a deep and abiding division in America, and that it will continue to grow unless people on both sides can reach across that divide and constructively engage with one another. In the past week, so much has been said about the liberal bubble and its contribution to the failed predictions of this campaign cycle. Much has been written about the mistake of writing off half of American voters as racist and misogynist. At the same time, there are many voices who seem to think that acknowledging the humanity of those we vehemently disagree with is a betrayal of our values. In this moment of social and political turmoil, I would be remiss if I didn't say, I think the opposite is true. My heart and mind were not changed by scorn, shame, or dismissal, even though these were heaped on me, understandably and justifiably, for over 20 years. They just don't work. Instead, I was changed by kind people who treated me with respect and civility, who took the time to learn what I really believed, and who challenged me gently but firmly. Their efforts have made me an advocate for the very people and ideas I once despised. These transformations don't happen overnight, but the fact that mine was initiated by dialogue on Twitter is a testament to just how powerful a few well-placed words can be when they're coming from patient, considerate people. And besides, we have 4 years. There is no question that the work of building bridges across cultural divides is an enormous undertaking, but this is the work ahead of us. For over 100 years, ADL has called us to join them in that work, whether it takes the form of education, research, or political advocacy. The people who make up this organization have been tireless, inventive, and dedicated, and answering their call has been one of the most rewarding decisions I've made since leaving Westboro. I am so grateful for the opportunity to stand with them and with you all to make sure that this work is successful. Thank you so much for having me.